Hello. This is a homily for the 22nd Sunday of the year. The first reading is taken from chapter 4 of the book of Deuteronomy, and Moses is explaining to the people the importance of the teaching, the statutes and decrees, as he phrases it, which I am teaching you to observe. The whole point is these decrees are true, they come from God, and if we are humble enough to follow them, we will be transformed, but then you will give evidence of your wisdom and intelligence to the nations. So this truth has a global effect. It transforms the world because these people literally are resonating with the sounds of God, if you want to use the metaphor of sound. People will ask, what great nation has statutes and decrees that are as just as this whole law which I'm setting before you today? Moses is trying to get into his people's heads that this law leads to the fulfillment of who they are individually and as a nation. And this fulfillment is very important because this theme then runs through. The psalm picks up this idea: the one who does justice will live in the presence of the Lord. Fulfillment again, by allowing ourselves to be transformed by the decrees and statutes of Almighty God, we will then live in the presence of the Lord by allowing ourselves to get reordered, reworked. And this is incredibly crucial. In political history, we have this awful problem of people blindly following ideologies, the thoughts of some particular historical figure, and just allowing their lives to dissipate and be wasted by these ideologies. And this has been so horribly evident in the 20th century, and it hasn't changed much in the 21st century. But if we follow the statutes and decrees of God, God made us, so God knows what we need. No philosopher knows what we need. Some philosophers are somewhat helpful sometimes, but we have to get the full picture, the whole story from God himself, and it's being delivered in this case by Moses. This life of justice that is formed by the statutes of God means that we can walk blamelessly. It means that we can think the truth in our hearts, which reshapes us just by the fact that we're contacting truth rather than contacting some ideology that will distort us. Whoever walks blamelessly and does justice will not slander with his tongue. We are hearing avalanches of slander these days, and I've been hearing Catholics saying the most hateful things. And that isn't Catholicism. This is a really serious corruption of the hearts and souls of human beings. Someone who does not harm his fellow man, nor take up a reproach against his neighbor. We're hearing a lot of that reproaching going on. The psalm has a lot more in it, obviously. I'm just taking a few isolated sentences. Then, strangely enough almost, we don't take the second reading from one of the letters of St. Paul, we take the reading from the book of James. James says, "All good giving and every perfect gift is from above, coming from the Father of lights." In other words, what comes from God, what we have seen happening in Moses' governorship of his people, is passing on the gifts of God's truth. What James says is God willed to give us birth by the word of truth. In other words, James understands that we are made for truth. Watching somebody lying, getting into a raging frenzy over something, this all shows the distortions that are inside them. And this is going to come up in the gospel. But this beautiful line from James, God willed to give us birth by the word of truth. Take God's teaching, take it into ourselves, and allow it to work on us. Help us to purify the concepts that we have in our heads. Get rid of the ideologies that we have in our heads. This is incredibly serious stuff. If we're not remade, we will not get to heaven. It's as blunt as that. Humbly welcome the word, he says, that has been planted in you and is able to save your souls. He couldn't be any more clear than that. Then he says, be doers of the word. In other words, if God has told us to be humble, courteous, considerate, respectful, etc., then let's be humble, courteous, and respectful, etc. By doing that, we are doing far more than following the mob and getting caught up in their rage and their hyperbole and their ridiculous statements that they make. Then he says, religion that is pure and undefiled is to care for orphans and widows in their afflictions, bearing in mind these are the most under-cared for people in society, and they still are, okay? And to keep oneself, this is pure religion, to keep oneself unstained by the world. Letting in all these raging ideologies that are flying around at the moment, filled with untruth, doesn't help anyone. It may make us feel good for a while, but it does stain us. And this is what he's saying. Pure religion is keeping oneself unstained by the world. Lastly, we have this part of Mark's Gospel, chapter 7. And here we have Jesus encountering the Pharisees and the scribes. Now, these were people who had gained their prominence in the century before through their defense of the truth of God. They had suffered and died for the truth of God. And we could actually take a leaf out of their book. But once the Pharisees got into positions of power, they kind of really lorded it over the people. And that, of course, is always the danger with any kind of power. But here you have the Pharisees criticizing the disciples of Jesus. The Pharisees are people who observe a number of traditions, and they say to Jesus, why don't your disciples follow the traditions that we follow? And Jesus says, well, did Isaiah prophesy about you hypocrites, as it is written, this people honors me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. That is a terrifying thing to hear. And the question for us is, where are our hearts? Are they raging over something that some reporter said, which we don't even know is true, okay? Or are our hearts very much settled in the truth that comes from God? This will give us a whole different perspective on the world around us and help us then to make some decent, accurate, critical judgments about what we see and what we hear. Jesus goes further. He takes the words of Isaiah and he says, in vain do they worship me. In other words, their behavior nullifies the worship that they are doing. And this is always a problem for any part of routine religion. Routine religion is good. It is beautiful that we go to Mass on Sunday. But if it just becomes routine, so that my heart is not burning to get to Mass on Sunday, then I'm missing something. And instead of worrying about what's going on around me, I should be worrying about what's going on inside of me. Jesus picks this up. He picks this interior spiritual state up. And he says, nothing that enters one from outside can defile that person. But the things that come out from within are what defile us. Now remember, defiling means that we are not ritually pure anymore. We cannot offer sacrifice. And in fact, we have to ask ourselves when we go to Mass on Sunday, are we pure enough to stand before Almighty God and join in the sacrifice, the offering of our incarnate Lord, glorified now, and offer him to the Father? Am I pure enough to do that? From within people, from their hearts, we're back at hearts again, come evil thoughts. This is a time of evil thoughts, so we had better be able to make good judgments about what is a good thought and an evil thought. Unchastity, theft, murder, greed, malice, deceit, and so on, and so on, and so on. All these evils, he says, come from within, and they defile. Because in fact, they express and literally add to our existence. But the question is, what do they add to our existence? Do I become more distorted as a human being? Is my anger poisoning my life, poisoning my way of seeing what's going on in the world? We are in a very violent time. It reminds me a lot of some of the mob behavior that one reads about during the French Revolution, where people literally became unhinged and just went wild. And if you look at social media at all, you will see that wildness there. And the question is, who are you serving with this rage? That isn't how human beings who follow Jesus Christ ought to behave. So what we've had are a series of readings helping us to understand with Moses that our following of God's law shows our whole people in a certain light, so much so that other people will be impressed. James then comes in and talks about the interiority and how we need to change our hearts. And lastly, we have Jesus, challenged by the Pharisees, the hypocrites. And God knows we have enough hypocrites around today, but we're learning from Jesus at the same time. we have to watch what comes out of us. Have a great day.